should impose term limits of on CEOs of publicly traded corporations. First observation are definitions, all of which are contextual except for publicly traded corporations. We will define as ownership that is dispersed throughout the general public in many shares of stock. So corporations that allow people to have shares in stocks, that's basically what these things are. The second observation, this is policy around because of the word should, which means you evaluate through net benefits. The role of the ballot is to vote for the best post-fiat policy option. The role of the ballot is to vote for the best post-fiat policy option. Two reasons why this is good. First of all, the state is inevitable. Even in systems of bartering, you can see here that like inner hierarchies are inevitable, which means we always have to look towards the state in order to create like social mobility. But second of all, consequential is good. You cannot know the outcome of something until like you don't even know if fire is hot until you touch it, which means you have to be able to test plan text before you understand how things are going to go play out. Third observation is the plan text. The United States federal government will impose should impose two-term limits of 6 years each. The United States federal government should impose two-term limits of 6 years each for CEOs of publicly traded corporations. This is going to happen as soon as possible and all through normal means. The solvency is that, first of all, according to Forbes, a lot of advisory boards of 5 to 6 people are basically the people that are going to be electing these presidents, and at most they're going to be serving up to 8 years when we mean 2 terms of 6 limits. 12 years, 2-term limits of 6 years each.
Oh, okay, can you just clarify because of what? Can you say the plan text one more time?
Yeah, the United States federal government should impose 2-term limits of 6 years each on CEOs of publicly traded corporations. Okay. The first advantage is about corruption. First of all, the uniqueness is that CEOs are corrupt if they're implemented really long term. The A argument is that they can bypass a lot of court systems because there's absolutely no accountability. Examples for this include the CEO of Wells Fargo and their successor basically were able to walk away from a mega bank with multi-million-dollar pay packages even after they created fake accounts and were found guilty. But the B argument is that the CEO of Equifax, even after they suffered the data breach, they suffered very minimal consequences, and their board of the company never checked back on the CEO and basically was able to return as like an employee of the company, which probably means that there's a large amount of corruption right now. But the second argument is that corruption means that there's absolutely no innovation because all of these CEOs become like lame ducks. According to Forbes, the CEOs that are implemented 10 to 20 years become like lame ducks, and the number of new ideas, the trajectory and the percentage of those actually decreases right around 12 to 15 years. The links is that, first of all, you're going to see that term limits enforce a whole bunch of accountability. A couple of warrants for this. The A argument is that Bill Hadge, the CEO of the Geo Environmental, basically subjected himself to accountability by the measures of the board and found $2 billion that were out of circulation of his company, and he was the type of CEO that said, okay, I'm only going to be in this company for only 6 years, which probably means that there was an increased accountability and more power to the advisory boards and the actual employees that were working in that company. But the B argument is that according to the BioSig, I'll take you after this, the BioSig technology welcomed like a new advisory board for the Aquacorp Health, and basically they're starting to crack down on corruption, which probably means that there are advisory boards that are able to check back the power of the CEOs. But the second link is that this term limits enforces a whole bunch of new ideas. The warrant for this is Netflix. You can see that the whole indeterminate process for how they employ all of their employees encourages a whole bunch of criticism and feedback, and even their CEO, or I don't even know if the CEO, I think it was the COO that basically stepped down after they realized that they were not contributing any new ideas, which probably means that at the point where advisors are going to be electing people that they know are going to be better for the actual company, there's more accountability, which means that we see net loss in the amount of money that is lost and less amounts of corruption. The impacts of the first of all, you can see this is key to maintaining rule of law. The A argument is that accountability can solve for up to $1 trillion that are by curbing a whole bunch of corruption. That if we are able to crack down on these individuals, we see that less of the employees are going to be cheated out of their like incomes or cheated out of like their taxes or something. But the B argument is that this signals nationwide that the entire like corporations of advisory boards are now going to be in checking all of these CEOs, which probably means that this signaling is key to maintaining investor confidence in the economy. You can see the investor confidence in the internal link to economic sustainability because like if investor confidence is low, that means that the economy is not in circulation. The second advantage is about the economy. What's happening right now in the unique is that monopolies are concentrated in a whole bunch of wealth. The A argument is that Facebook and Google monopolize 20 to 35% of their market shares, with the CEOs in the top 1% of wealth. And this is the B argument that this is exacerbating the inequality gap. You can see here this is widening as corporations grow and grow, and the CEOs are the ones that are concentrating the most amount of power. For example, in 1996, young people, innovators, and entrepreneurs or startups the rate was 35%, but it has shortened now to 18% as of 2014. And all of these employees literally earn 54% less than all of their like higher board, higher up authorities, which probably means that CEOs are the ones that are contributing to a lot of income inequality. The second argument is that this is causing a brink of collapsing the economy. The argument that they're not hiring enough workers specifically are due to these, like the CEOs and their types of policies. You can see here that as of February 2019, the indicators for specifically hiring more and more people in these larger companies has slowed dramatically, and this is causing an economic uncertainty. You can see that this is also contributing. You can also see the speculation is happening as a result of the inverted yield curve, because of the fact that like the United States is looking towards another recession, which probably means that we need more workers in order to instill this type of confidence long term. It links to that, first of all, where monopolies are going to be limited, which probably means that they're less able to concentrate the wealth, which indicates that the economy, that perceptually they are changing. The A argument is that, again, the Bill Hadge CEO basically was able to complete 7 different acquisitions and increase his employee base by 35% when he was the one that was when he was being elected, and only for 6 years, which indicates that if we're employing CEOs that are more likely to hire employees, this solves for the perceptual brink that is happening right now. But the B argument is that investor confidence encourages young entrepreneurs to be elected for the new boards, especially if a lot of individuals who don't feel that they can become entrepreneurs in the startups are now incentivized to do so because they feel that they can move up the corporate ladder. That probably means that we solve perceptually for the brink argument as well. The second argument is prevents collapse. You can see here that this is really important for small businesses because small businesses make up 99.7% of the employee firms and up to 40 to 50% of all of these new innovation ideas, which probably means that we're getting a whole bunch of these new younger entrepreneurs into the positions of CEO corporate positions. We see a net increase in the amount of GDP growth. But the impacts that, first of all, the economy is key for a couple of reasons. The A argument is that this is key to preventing poverty. A whole bunch of people that are not being hired right now, the first to be impacted are the ones on the brink of poverty, which means that we are key to preventing things like structural violence, which marginalized individuals are the first to not be picked for job process. But the B argument is that this is key for big and small businesses to expand because it indicates that the economy is going to be stable, which means that if the United States economy collapses, it expands to the world because 65% of the world liquidity is in the United States dollar. The C argument is that this is key for decreasing types of environmental extraction methods. When the economy is bad, we are more likely to go to war. We are more likely to default to dirty extraction methods. I have 10 seconds to answer a question. Do you have any questions?
Oh yeah, can you clarify on your first advantage? Can you clarify the first example you give, like the?
Yeah, I said right now CEOs are able to bypass a lot of corruption and like there's no accountability. I gave the Wells Fargo CEO example and also the Equifax CEO example.
Okay.
What's the order?
Off piece and then.
How many off piece positions?
Just one. I don't know how many sheets you need, but.
Or you could probably tag team.
Wait, do we have a counterpoint? You could write one. Okay, 2 off, sorry.
But
Wait, are we reading it?
there's no need.
Okay, then 1 off, sorry. Double, sorry.
Are you okay with on tag team?
Sure, but I
Yeah.
Wait, so how many off? 2 or 3?
just one.
Just one? Okay.
I'm okay with tag teaming.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay. 8 minutes on the clock. Yeah. Starting with the idea of preventing effective business uniqueness. 1, the current business structure is functioning in America. A, rogue CEOs are the exception and not the rule. That's a quote from Forbes. B, CEO tenure is decreasing, is near an all-time low according to Harvard Law School in 2018. C, checkbacks exist. Forbes, quote, a CEO could always be removed for a lack of performance or moral and ethical indiscretions. D, shareholders decide a board of directors who nominate CEOs every fiscal year, so problems naturally go away if the board of directors wants to not have a CEO. CEOs don't have unilateral control. 2, our economy is doing well. A, according to CNBC 2018, quote, the economy has achieved feats most experts thought impossible. B, there's a 3% plus GDP growth. C, unemployment is nearing an all-time low. D, the stock market has risen 27% among a, quote, surge in corporate profits. 3, BizCon is, quote, unquote, soaring. According to CNBC, consumer sentiment is at its highest level in 18 years. The link, 1, CEO term limits prevent a board of directors and thus shareholders from having lasting influence in company leadership. 2, there's a perceptual link because these people will acknowledge that they have less power and thus there's less value in actually being a shareholder or being a board of directors member. Internal link 1, shareholders will be less likely to buy shares and invest. B, businesses will have less economic support, losing a main way to economically survive. C, business confidence will significantly decrease because businesses won't have money to use in expansion. D, Jim Taylor, PhD, writes, quote, confidence is the most important psychological contributor to performance in business. Also, confidence impacts every other psychological contributor to performance in business. E, lack of,
What's your visa point?
The visa point is that businesses will have less economic support, which loses a main way to survive. Obviously, being a publicly traded business is very important because you can get money from public. So the ESA point is that lack of confidence means less expansion, which means lower wages and lack of job creation because less hiring. So the second internal is CEO limits will remove effective leaders, causing businesses to be run properly. This is pretty self-explanatory. If somebody is a good leader for a business, they should not just be removed on a time limit. They should be taken away when they're actually bad for the company and they're not doing well economically. So for the impacts, one is wages and employment. Extend all of the poverty impacts and the wage impacts that they provide in the affirmative. Second is we need the United States to be economically competitive, and it's national business growth. Moving on to the affirmative. We agree with all of their framing. We believe, definitions are contextual. Ownership is dispersed through the public. This is a policy round, and you should evaluate it through post-fiat impacts. On the plan, 2 term limits of 6 years each. Yeah, sure. Let's go into the advantages. One is corruption, the uniqueness. First of all, they talk about how people are corrupt and there's no accountability. Okay, first of all, extend all of the uniqueness arguments I made about how there definitely is accountability and also how the uniqueness they're citing. They give 2 examples. Those examples are very rare. As the Forbes quote says, rogue CEOs are the exception and not the rule. Secondly, what they say later contradicts this. They talk about companies that actually encourage accountability and are doing well in terms of accountability and stopping corruption, like Netflix. So clearly we see that overall this is an issue that is insignificant, this corruption issue. Yeah.
Turn when you have more CEOs going in more quickly, and if CEOs are so bad, then you're just going to have more CEOs that are corrupt.
Yeah, on the link, turn if you have more CEOs and more ineffective CEOs, and corruption is going to increase. So next, they talk about Equifax specifically, and this is a very important example because they say that the board is not checking back. At that point, if the board is staying the same and you don't have term limits on board members or whatever, who's to say that the board isn't just going to elect another person like the previous corrupt CEO, right? They have no link here because they don't solve. If the board is corrupt, then nothing changes at all because the board is just going to elect another horrible CEO. Let's move on. Second, on the link. So first of all, they talk about the $2 billion out of circulation. The example they give is literally a company that was accountable. The example they give proves that the uniqueness is on our side, that we're actually the status quo is good, basically. Next, they talk about new ideas and how Netflix encourages good leadership and is accountable. Again, that's an example of how the status quo is actually working. On the impacts, they talk about rule of law. We agree that rule of law is important. However, they don't actually link into any of these impacts because they're not solving the problem, first of all. And secondly, this issue is completely non-unique because, again, as I said, the status quo solves. Yeah.
Also, there's so much innovation in the status quo. It's not true.
Yeah, also there's innovation in the status quo. It's not true that there's no innovation. Next, specifically on the impact, they talk about how $1 trillion is lost because people are being cheated out of stuff. What? I didn't get a source for this argument. Just saying $1 trillion, I don't really know where this comes from, but this is a pretty wild estimate. But even still, we agree that rule of law is important. If you really want to enforce accountability and stuff, you should just be sticking with the status quo because their own examples prove that accountability is upheld in the status quo. Let's move on to the second advantage of econ. On the uniqueness, they say monopolies are giving CEOs money, and that CEOs, Yeah, they say that basically monopolies are giving CEOs a lot of money. However, what they're missing is that this argument is important because monopolies giving CEOs money, or CEOs being corrupt and trying to monopolize, and that getting the company money is a reason why the board would just elect more CEOs in a similar position, right? I'm trying to slow down to clarify my thoughts here. But basically, again, there's another no-link argument here because why would the CEOs why would the board of directors, whatever the board is called, why would the board elect more CEOs that are not trying to monopolize if the whole point of the board and of shareholders is to increase the economic development of the company? Right? That would be completely counterproductive to the entire company's point because the company wants to get money and monopolization gives you money. Thus, the only thing that's going to happen is a continuation of what they say the status quo is, where monopolies are going to continue to exist and the board of directors is going to continue to get CEOs who are trying to monopolize because naturally they want money. That's literally their job as the board and the job of the shareholder.
They don't solve the thing about inequality because if you have more CEOs, it just means you're going to be giving the money to more people. Right now, you're just giving the money to one CEO, but if you have a bunch, then you're going to give even more money to all of those CEOs.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is... I'm just going to move on to later in their link. Yeah. So basically, they talk about how we're... Wait, okay. I have it on a different sheet. That's why I'm so confused right now. Do I? Am I stupid?
I can stop.
I'm so confused. Okay. Wait. Oh yeah, it's here. Okay, so on the link, they talk about decreasing monopolies. Again, no link. Why would the board elect a CEO that is literally losing the company money by not monopolizing? Next, they talk about young entrepreneurs. Turn this argument, there's probably just going to be more old dudes being elected. Why would the board of directors elect like a young entrepreneur that probably has a lot less experience than an old person who's been working in the business for so long, right? And also, secondly, like, who's to say that CEOs aren't just going to swap from similar business to similar business if they're the most experienced people? And who's to say that the board of directors is not just going to elect these more experienced people? Probably what's going to happen is similar businesses are going to have their CEOs like swapping around, right? Because they have the similar experience and they will similarly get the money to the company like the same. Next, they talk about econ and poverty. Again, we agree that's like our main impact too, but they don't actually reach this impact. They talk about small businesses are important. Imagine a small business that's trying to like, you know, economically benefit, and then their best leader is just taken out of their business. Their best leader is no longer allowed to actually have this, right? That's a complete turn, because basically what's going to happen, the small business doesn't have effective leadership. They shut down at the root, which means, yeah, again, small businesses, we agree they're good, but you're actually decreasing the likelihood that they survive, yeah.
There's no brink because the brink exists for all time because the brink is allegedly in the status quo.
Yeah, the brink is in the status quo.
There's no brink. It's existed for
yeah,
the
there's
entirety
no
of
brink.
capitalism.
Yeah, the brink is non-unique to the status quo. Or sorry,
There
I
is
don't
no
even
brink.
know. Wait, we're not. Yeah, there is no brink. That's my point. I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're saying there's a brink of collapse. And that collapse.
What do we say? Negates.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I didn't understand. What's happening?
Yeah, it's a flow lounge. You
I
don't
know.
have to.
Didn't have to dress up for this either. Okay. At the net.
Yeah, that's one good thing about the changes to TOC, explicitly encouraging casual attire.
Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah. Okay, is everyone ready?
Wait, sorry,
Hold on a second.
after neg?
Yep.
Okay, we're like all out of whack
It's
here.
all good. Ready?
Just give me like 15 seconds.
Sure.
On the topic case, you're going to want to extend our first solvency argument about how advisory boards also only serve 12 years on average, which means that all their arguments about how the board is going to continually elect more corrupt people probably is already felt by the fact that these boards are also going to see new people coming in. On the first advantage about corruption, on the uniqueness level, they make this argument that our
Information.
Yeah, I'll take that at the end of the advantage. They make the argument that all of our arguments about corruption are rare examples. A couple responses here. The first response is that even if they're small examples, it has a large impact. You can look towards the Wells Fargo scandal that literally implicated everybody that had a Wells Fargo account and had their information stored within these Wells Fargo accounts, which means even if they're rare examples, you have to have affirmative. But the second response here is that some companies have they make this argument about how like all these good companies exist, which means we don't need a plan. But even if some companies have adopted our plan, clearly it's not sufficient. If all these data breaches and all these corruption and all these CEOs can still escape all this punishment. But the third response here is that this is not a real example. You can look towards studies done by the Harvard Business Review that reviewed over allegations of CEO misconduct from 2000 to 2015, and they found that even though there was media coverage, share prices weren't even impacted by all these CEOs doing like super bad things, indicating that there's no pressure for them to step down within the status quo. And additionally, it only impacted the CEO's job prospects like half the time anyway, which means that there's no check back within the status quo. Next, on our argument about the board, they say that if the board can't check back, they won't be able to check back in the future. The first response here is that if this is true, it's still a tried out to the affirmative. This is only a defensive argument. But the second response here is that the only reason that the board doesn't have any power is because they're currently ceding to these super old, super powerful CEOs that have all these connections and have all this money, which means there's only a risk that the board is able to check back when you pass the affirmative plan. But third, you can extend our argument for how the board also recycles its members, which probably means we're able to resolve this even in the world of the status quo. You can extend our second uniqueness argument about how corruption means there's no innovation right now, and because CEOs that serve for 10 to 20 years are basically lame ducks. They make arguments about innovation, how this happening in the status quo. There's no articulation here. You can also extend my partner's analysis about how small businesses are specifically being hurt by the fact that these large corporations have all these corrupt practices and aren't able to innovate at the same rate. Okay, on the link level. They make this argument about how turn more CEOs means there's going to be more corruption. The first argument here is that there's simply no analytic or explanation for how this is true. Secondly, there's no warrants to buy this. Third of all, our argument is that having more options is still going to be better because if you have a corrupt CEO, then having someone to replace them is always going to be better. Having an option to be able to kick them out is always going to be better because they can't be kicked out now because they're always able to sidestep the disciplinary concerns, which means that if they're forced to leave after 12 years, that means at least we'll get better people in there, which means there's always going to be less corruption. Next, they make an argument about how our warrants prove good uniqueness. Like, no, these are link warrants. These are analogous to the situation. They show why our plan has solvency. I don't know why this is an argument, but second of all, our argument is that writ large things are still going to be really bad. Just because these small companies or like a company like Netflix have enforced similar policies does not mean that our app does not have inherency. You can extend all of our reasons for why term limits force these companies to become more accountable and give these companies a way to remove CEOs that are problematic because there's no other mechanism to remove problematic CEOs within the world of the status quo. Secondarily, you can extend our second link about new ideas and innovation. This was completely conceded, which means we do have access to our impact about innovation and rule of law. On the impact level of rule of law, they make an argument about there's no link to rule of law. I don't understand why there's no link because they didn't answer our links. Accountability is pretty clearly able to solve for issues like rule of law because accountability and the way our businesses are perceived internationally is tied to the way that CEOs have the power to sidestep. I'll take it at the advantage. Have the ability to sidestep all the disciplinary issues within the status quo, which means we definitely have a link. And yeah, they just read this innovation argument that I've already answered. Extend the rest of the impact level. Yeah.
So how is rule of law enforced when you can actually like fiat, or you can actually assume at all that these people are going to be prosecuted?
Our argument is like even if they don't get prosecuted, first of all, they're still removed, which is better because they're not influencing company policy. But secondarily, we'd argue that having them removed is the prerequisite to being prosecuted because they don't have the resources, they don't have the clout, they don't have the media coverage that they do when they're actually in the position. On the second advantage about economy, extend the entirety of the econ story about how monopolies are killing the economy and the status quo. However, we're on the brink of collapse since February 2019. This probably answers a lot of their disadvantage about how the economy is doing well, because even if it's doing well now, we're already on the brink of collapse because of the fact that our hiring processes are currently unstable. Next, on the link level, they make an argument about how boards will still elect more corrupt CEOs. A couple responses here. First is that this is going to be empirically denied. You can look at the company case study that my partner provided out of GCA about how Bill Hatch was able to have better CEOs that were able to increase the employer base and increase things like wages, which probably means we're able to succeed. Secondarily, it's not a question about monopolies, it's about how bad CEOs can pay for themselves but not pay for the wages themselves, which means even if we aren't able to solve for monopolies writ large, we're still able to solve for how bad CEOs monopolize the company practices. But third of all here, we would make the argument that even if the board will inevitably have to elect younger CEOs because the turnover rate is super high, there aren't enough old people left anyway, which means you're going to inevitably have to elect younger people. We make the argument that younger people is always going to be better. Additionally, there's also a very high probability that younger people will be elected because you can look towards the case studies that we provided. For example, the GZA company ended up hiring a lot more younger people in higher positions of management because they didn't have any other people to hire. You can look towards the fact that young CEOs generated 16% larger return performance than older CEOs, which means we always have a risk of solvency here. Next, they make this argument about how more CEOs means that there's going to be more people, which is bad, but they're not going to be more CEOs than once we just have one CEO. I don't understand how this matters. Secondarily, their argument about how more CEOs means we have to pay the CEOs more, it makes no sense because CEOs will have to be paid less, and then their wages are always increased as they stay longer at a firm, which means inevitably if you have high turnover rates, that means CEOs will inevitably get paid less, which means it's solved. No. Next, they make this argument about more old seats getting elected. Again, this is empirically denied. Secondarily, even if this is true, we're still solvency long term because we incentivize people to actually run and try to get these positions from their lower positions because now they have an option and an opportunity to get elected by the board of investors, which they didn't have in the past. And finally, this triad eye, this is not offense. Next, they make this argument about how it's going to harm small businesses. The first argument here is that not all small businesses are publicly traded anyway because they're really small, which means there's no impact. But secondarily, you can look towards the fact that small businesses are specifically calling for this because they realize they're the ones harmed by the monopolies and the bad practices by the CEOs of these larger companies. So you can just look towards the warrants of why small businesses are the ones who specifically want our policy. Finally, they make this argument about why there's no brink. The brink is February 2019. The brink started February 2019, and also if there's no brink, there's no risk of your disadvantage. On the disadvantage. Over here on the disadvantage, there's literally no warrants for how this disadvantage is true, which means you have absolutely no reason to buy this. On the uniqueness level, they talk about businesses are currently functioning, about how all these rogue problems. You can cross by my analysis about Harvard Business Review that shows writ large there's a trend of CEOs being able to escape detection, escape prosecution, escape being fired because of the fact that they have so much money, they have so much power, because they spend so much time in their office in the first place. The argument is that spending less time in this office means that there's always going to be risk that you're more likely to be prosecuted to resolve these issues. Next, they make this argument about tenures decreasing the status quo. If the tenures already decreasing the status quo, that means there's a very low risk of business backlash because businesses already expecting this and they already want this, which means their dissat is not terminally thumped by itself. Next, you make this argument about checkbacks currently exist. Obviously, the checkbacks are insufficient at the point where all these CEOs are able to escape disciplinary practices, and at the point where all these CEOs are able to allow the economy to collapse by not hiring enough people and having these unstable hiring practices in the first place. So clearly, it's insufficient. Next, you make this argument about shareholders are nominating. Shareholders nominate, which means the power is within the shareholders. But our argument is that the longer you stay within a position, the more power you have over the shareholders, the more power you have over the board of directors in the first place, which means that tenure is internally to strength. Next, they make this argument about the economy doing well. A couple answers to this. The first argument is that the yield curve is flattening out within the U.S., which is the predictor of the last 5 recessions, which means that the economy is probably not doing that well. It's tried out for the firm. Secondarily, you can look towards the fact that even if unemployment is super low, it doesn't matter because wages are also super low, which means it's unsustainable growth. The third argument here is that stock increases are meaningless because other indicators, for example, small businesses who are depreciating within the status quo are always a better indicator because small businesses are the one driving 99.7% of the economy. They make this con argument. I think I've already answered it on the link level. They say this argument prevents the board of directors from having power. Our argument is that this gives the board of directors more power because the age is always going to be thumping the power of the board of directors because of the fact that the older CEOs know the position, they know the power, they know the money, etc. I've already made this argument. Next, they have this perceptual argument, but there's no perceptual link at the point where businesses already want this policy, as we've already articulated. Next, their first internal link about shareholders buying through shows. The first argument is that shareholders already want this. You can look towards the fact that a 2016 survey of investors and shareholders indicates strong support for CEO limits, which means our plan will probably incentivize more people to buy stocks in the first place. Secondarily, you can look towards the fact that consumer confidence and consumer trust within corporations is at an all-time low, and only passing a plan is able to have consumers put trust within these companies in the first place, which will incentivize them to buy more stocks, which means we're probably able to resolve this in the first place. Next, on their second internal link about bad leaders, you can turn this argument about how we incentivize better leaders to go into office because of the fact that bad leaders are the status quo. Secondarily, you can cross-apply my response about how we incentivize younger people to go for these positions, which increases their amount of returns, like they have a 60% higher return. Additionally, you can look towards the fact that younger leaders are also ranked more positively in every single leadership behavior out of 49 in a new study, which means they're better. You don't have access to your impacts; they aren't even internalized. No break. Vote app.
Feel free to let me know if there's anything. Okay.
What's your order?
Case.
What math or after neg?
Case. So, after that.
After neg.
You're going to be voting neg because this is not what the corporations want, and if they wanted to do it, they'd do it on their own, and there's no benefit to forcing them to do it. Okay. So, on their case. So, first they say that there's this issue of corruption. They say there's no accountability. They give the example of Wells Fargo and Equifax. Then tells you that there is accountability in the status quo, and because of the examples that they give, and also he says that a turn because there's going to be more corruption when you have more CEOs going through more quickly, right? So they respond to this by saying that having more options is better. I don't really understand this articulation whatsoever because there are options right now. The way that businesses work right now is you have shareholders that every fiscal year will elect a board of directors who then in turn elect the CEO. That is something that is how we have worked as a capitalist nation, like for the past century, right? That is how business works. Remember, the only change that they are making is that they are making it so then every 6 years that they are forced out of that position, and then the board of directors has to nominate a new CEO, which links into our disad, which is the disad. Pretty bad. Okay, so this whole thing about like Wells Fargo, for example, Wells Fargo is a good example for our side because the Wells Fargo CEO, he resigned at the point at which this scandal happened. This happens in many different corporations. When something bad happens that the CEO does, that means that the board of directors gets a new CEO. When there is, if the board of directors is bad, then the shareholders elect a new board of directors. That is the way our economic system works. They're throwing this off. This is why you have the business confidence falling, because it's a bad idea.
They say that they solve because CEOs will have less money and thus will be prosecuted. Like, why would CEOs have less money unless you're like,
They say that
taking
they
the
solve
money away
because
from them?
CEOs will have less money and thus they'll be prosecuted. Why would they have less money unless you're taking the money away from them? And
Like,
also,
they still have the money.
they still have the money. Furthermore, in response to this, most CEOs get their money through receiving shares. They're still going to be having these shares either way. Also, I was trying to get Ben to say this, but what happens is when you have more and more CEOs that are suddenly coming into the company every 6 years, when, for example, you might just have one over a long period of time, all these CEOs, their incentive for being a CEO is that they get a bunch of money, right? If you have all these CEOs that are going through this pipeline, that means the corporations are going to be losing so much more money because they're giving the same amount of money to all these different CEOs. That is going to be a really big problem for these companies. It's a really bad idea. Okay, so yeah, they say CEOs don't escape punishment. So moving on. So the big issue here is that they're focusing on the wrong problem. The wrong problem is not term limits for the CEO. It's about the board of directors. Nothing changes. There's no difference between they don't solve anything because the board of directors is still electing people either way.
And the board of directors is being elected by the shareholders.
And the board of directors is being elected by the
all
shareholders.
of the same arguments I made about the board of directors also apply to shareholders.
All the same arguments that Ben made about the board of directors also apply to shareholders.
Who want the best for the
Who
company.
want the best for the company. The
Yeah.
checks exist in the status quo. That is why we have massive innovation in the status quo. That's why the brink doesn't exist. That's why there is no inherency right now. There's no reason to do this. They're just going to throw everything off. In response to this very true argument, they say, well, it's try or die, which is a non-response. They say that there's a risk of solvency, which is concession that it's a very weak argument, right? So they say try or die. Okay, yeah, there's an infinitely small percent chance that this is going to do anything. So they say try to do this or not. The point at which there is no inherency, when there are no problems that need to be solved, you're not going to be voting for the affirmation because there is no reason to solve and because it is so little likelihood of solving, and the likelihood of the DA far outweighs that. It's a concession, very clearly. So yeah, there's no solvency happening. And corruption already has checks. Literally, there are examples of Netflix, all these different things. Actually, I already said this. I don't know why I'm repeating it. Okay, moving on to the links. Okay, so for the links, they say that that there's like corruption. That now you'll be funding corruption. Oh yeah. So really, their only functional link that is true here. The only thing that they are changing is their only link scenario that makes any sense is, okay, now they're going to be forced to find young people who will then take the place of the old CEOs. And that's good because they're more productive and stuff like that. Okay, this is really problematic. First of all, because it's not true. If you have, are they saying that you're running out of old business people? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you have so many people in the business realm who have experience, who are old. Any sort of young people impacts are non-unique because shareholders and board of directors want to do it.
And also, young people get older.
And young people get older, right?
Like,
So like that doesn't make sense. Like if you have young people,
just move on.
Okay.
It's
it's like a funny. Okay, so yeah, non-unique. All this is non-unique. Anything that they're talking about can literally be done in the status quo. The check on any sort of corruption, on any of these issues in the status quo, is that you have the board of directors, you have the shareholders doing what is best for the company. This does not change whatsoever. All this does is it throws off companies because good CEOs are forced out. Like an example I'm thinking about is like Elon Musk. If he was thrown out of all of his companies, all these companies would collapse. Those are very significant companies for like the world because he does good stuff. So that'd be a bad thing to do. Okay, so moving on. They said that there's no mechanisms to remove CEOs in this quo, which I don't know why they're saying this. It's just literally false. If that was true, then this is false. There's no. So then, if this is true, then their advantage relies on this. Okay. So moving on. Is there anything else you want me to say on this sheet?
No.
Okay. 2. Economy. So they say that you want that there's like inequality and that CEOs are going to have like a lot of money. Cross-apply what we said before. Literally, you're going to be turn this because CEOs are just going to get more money. They keep their shares. They keep their money. You're not solving anything. So then they said that they're on the brink issue. So let me just explain this plain and clear. Throughout the history of our economic system, where we have shareholders who then elect the board of directors, who then elect the CEO, that is they're saying that that's what is causing the brink, that you have this issue. If that has existed for the entirety of our economic system and we have not had economic collapse, we still have an economy, then the brink that's a crazy brink because nothing's happened for a really long time, all right? So I think it's very low likelihood that there's a brink there. So then they said that if there's no brink and there's no risk, then there's no reason for the DA, which doesn't make sense. What our DA is saying is that the status quo is good, that it's good right now, that there is no brink, that everything is fine, that we need to calm down and not make crazy decisions like they're saying. Okay, then, so the brink clearly does not exist. They said, never happened. Okay, on the internal links, they say that, this is where the old people issue is, right? So I already explained this. Is there anything else they want me to do here?
No.
Okay. So on the dissat, this is going to be the main reason that you're not going to be voting for the affirmation. The dissat is that you are throwing off the economy. We tell you the economy is good, although they do say, the yield thing is upside down. They don't explain in depth what that means. You can't have an invincible assertion. You need to defend it. It's not true. When we give you multiple separate explanations that the employment is low, stock market is high, GDP is the highest it's been in a while, like our CNBC evidence, all this goes unresponded. The economy is good right now, right? So they said that there's that there's like that companies won't be expecting backlash because they want this. Companies aren't expecting this type of intervention from the government, so there will be backlash. And extend the whole links. Anything specifically? Let me say this in my last second.
No.
Okay, so just like literally extend. There's so much stuff that's dropped here. There's plenty of ground for us to go on this dissent.
So order is an overview, and then I'm going to be going over the DA and explaining like clearly the scenario, etc. And then I'm going to be doing aff real quick, like talking about that too, and then when. Okay. Overview, it's a clear vote for the negation at the point where their own contradictory evidence still doesn't prove a link to actually solving anything. Let's go on the DA. Extend all the uniqueness arguments. This quote clearly solves this. They don't actually disprove any of the arguments that we have in the uniqueness, like how rogue CEOs are the exception. That's according to somebody from Forbes who literally studies this. Rogue CEOs are the exception. Again, CEO tenure is decreasing. Check bags exist according to both Forbes and also because of the inherent rules in the system where shareholders decide a board of directors. This means that this quote definitely solves. If these people really wanted the CEO to be out, they would do it in the next fiscal year, right? And that's literally how the system works, and that's why the system is functioning. Next on the uniqueness, they concede that BizCon is, quote, soaring, and that consumer sentiment is at its highest level in 18 years. That's specifically key because that's the most relevant to our scenario here about how consumer confidence and business confidence is going to significantly decrease. And that's according to CNBC. I don't know if I just said that, but basically, yeah, the uniqueness clearly supports our side here. They concede the BizCon soaring and consumer sentiment, everything about that. Don't let them make arguments like consumer trust is at an all-time low when they don't support it and when we have clear evidence proving otherwise. The economy is doing well. The brink would have happened if it really existed. It's too bad it doesn't. Let's move on. The DA scenario, the only real refutation was that we don't have anything warranted, but we clearly explained the entire scenario about how CEO term limits prevent a board of directors and thus shareholders from having lasting influence. On top of the perceptual link, shareholders have no influence in their company at all. Businesses will have less economic support, etc., etc. Now, confidence is, again, they concede this, confidence is the most important psychological contributor to performance in business. That's specifically key because it means that if we link into business confidence, it doesn't matter what any of their econ arguments are because we are more important. Business confidence is more important in terms of determining success of a company. So the impacts, again, extend every impact that they say about poverty, about wages, how those are important, and also the conceded impact we say about how the United States is going to be more globally economically competitive. It's also very important. So yeah, on the affirmative. The most important things here, first of all the terms that we extend that Nolan said. Secondly, they have no links. This is really important. I'm going to summarize their link arguments real quick. First of all, they talk about rule of law. The most important thing here is that you cannot just prosecute somebody after you remove him, right? Especially when it's a CEO who has $1 bazillion to defend himself with. They're not taking away money from CEOs, and thus they're not actually making them vulnerable to prosecution, which is their only link on this argument. Next, they talk about how basically they're solving for innovation. Again, extend all of the arguments, that we made previously. On their next argument, they talk about monopolization. Again, to summarize what we've said here, monopolization will still happen because shareholders want the best for their business. They want the most money. Monopolization gets the most money. That's why it exists. Shareholders will elect board people who think the same, and they will elect CEOs who think the same. The system is the exact same because shareholders are not on a term limit. That would be ridiculous. So basically, they have no link on any of these arguments, and the rule of law thing especially is ridiculous. Extend the argument I made. Where's the source for the 1 trillion? When, aside from this rule of law argument, we have access to the same economic impacts. So the only question is who better links. The first thing you're looking at here is the clear and warranted arguments that we make about how the status quo is currently sufficient and that you're clearly going to be completely disrupting the chain. Extend specifically what we say, as I said earlier, about BizCon and consumer sentiment, and extend again that confidence is the most important contributor to performance in business, which means that if we link into confidence, even if they have all of their econ links, we still outweigh because it's more important as they conceded. So basically, when you look at these econ arguments, clearly we see that we have the higher probability of disrupting the economy. They have a higher probability of disrupting the economy, causing this long-term economic damage. Yeah, both neg.
The order will be the aff and then.
What's the slides?
Notes in your sheet.
Okay. absolutely no warrants coming from the negative side. The overview to the first advantage is that there's no other mechanisms to remove bad CEOs. They concede all of Sharon's analysis that in the status quo, even if the board is elected every single in the status quo right now, and we're not irrespective of the plan, they cannot kick out the bad CEOs in the status quo, which probably means that there is no uniqueness for the status quo to kick out people that are really bad. But second of all, even if the risk is very small, everybody is literally accountable. They're losing trillions of dollars, which probably means that there is a massive impact that they are conceding, even if there are very small rogue actors. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, even if good CEOs still exist and we're forcing them to be kicked out, they don't respond to the record low levels of business confidence and record low levels of the amount of innovation that is happening, irrespective of whether or not we can actually catch these people, which probably means that the point where the trajectory is literally at all-time low within the past 10 to 20 years of CEOs that are becoming lame ducks. That probably means that even the good CEOs aren't good over a long period of time, which means that we need to purge them every 6 years, which probably means that they have absolutely no analysis to prove why there are other options that are in the status quo. Because if there are other options, we would have done them already, which means that only the affirmative has a risk of solvency. You can extend Sharon's argument about how there's according to the Harvard review, misconduct was looked over from 2000 to 2015, and only half of the employees that had corruption were implicated half of the time, which means that even if there are any options that are right now in the status quo, they're not doing enough. You're preferring our meta-analysis over their nebulous claims because they never give you any specific evidence as to how specifically these new options are able to resolve it in the status quo, which probably means that you're always going to be looking for a risk of solving. They try to say the board of electors are elected by the shareholders. I will get to this debate later, but they're not losing on they're losing on the warrant debate because the only thing that is contested is the Wells Fargo example. But we don't need the Wells Fargo example to prove why no CEOs are going to get more corrupt once you pass their plan. There are no examples. All of our link warrants are literally not indicative of the status quo working. They're indicative of when CEOs are only there for a 6-tier term limit. That is good because they're incentivized to not be lame ducks. That probably means that all of these examples, even if they are happening in the status quo, they're not descriptive of the status quo. They're descriptive of what our plan could pass, and they never it's literally that's the articulation of why there is a try to die for the app. On the impact level, they are trying to talk about how prosecution doesn't happen, but first of all, you can see that they're removed every 6 years, so it doesn't even matter if they're prosecuted or not, as long as they're no longer implicating the company and causing a whole bunch of corruption. But second of all, even if they're not prosecuted, they are removed, which basically means that their power can no longer be concentrated part of the company, which means they cannot use the company's power to shield them from a whole bunch of prosecution, which basically means they will be able to be prosecuted within the future, which in terms of impact, there is a rule of law if they are necessarily getting, if the accountability is now on the board of electors. They shouldn't make all these arguments about how the board is going to be concentrating all of this money, but they've conceded the solvency argument that they are also recycling every 12 years, which means there's no risk of increasing monopolies once you pass the plan. On the second advantage of the economy, the overview is that there is a break right now. There are not enough people being hired. It's not about shareholders, which means we control the internal link to their disadvantage. First of all, you can see that we're winning in terms of probability. You can see that hiring is the internal link to their disadvantage for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it is the internal link to business confidence. Stock value doesn't matter, which are the only indicators that they have brought up, which is GDP and the stock market and the stock value. These are not good indicators of the economy because like the big monopolies can just be creating a whole bunch of products which increase our GDP, but that does not interact with the fact that unemployment rate is literally decreasing, and there is a brink as of February 2019, which means you're always going to be preferring our brink periods before theirs. But second of all, you can see that we are the internal link to consumer confidence because they've conceded all of our status quo arguments for why wage gaps are currently increasing and more concentrated towards CEOs and how it's contributing to a whole bunch of inequality. And with the point where they concede that is becoming more and more centralized in the status quo, that means that we have the internal link to consumer confidence because now consumers don't even see these businesses as willing to hire them and know that no longer they're willing to support them, which means that we are controlling all the perceptual links on the economy debate. But you're always going to be preferring our strength of link first because trust in the business themselves comes before trust in being able to buy things, which probably means that trust in the CEO. Like people know who, like the CEO of Apple is, which probably means that trust our perceptual links are always going to be coming before theirs. They've conceded on the link level about how there's a they've conceded on the link level about how monopolies are necessarily going to be limited, and which means on the impact level they've never contested about how small businesses are the number one indicator for keeping up the economy, which means that if those small businesses now we have a high probability of incentivizing these young entrepreneurs to feel like they can actually be elected for any type of CEO in the future, which means we have more long-term solvency. It's not a question of like old people, it's a question of these young entrepreneurs being able to enter the job market to prevent the entire economy from collapsing, which means that we have a higher magnitude impact than any of their disadvantage. Their disadvantage, there's no risk, they isolate no brink, which means there's a very low probability. Our second advantage controls the internal link to this. You can extend the turnover here that consumer confidence is an all-time low, which means there's no trust in companies right now, which means that there is no unique offense on the sheet, you can vote aft.